Ready to go if you are.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it, and it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Deb. Let me get you squared away and ready to go here. All right. So, as we discussed in part one, that was largely a nuts and bolts discussion on basics for weather and things for you to be aware of in terms of interpreting surface analyses and things of that nature. So, this discussion goes a little bit further than that. Applications for boaters. We're going to be talking about cloud progression and how you can use clouds to better understand what weather might be, in your future. So we'll also go about using surface analyses to see where you would find or what kind of cloud covers you would find in given areas, whether it's in an area of high pressure or in advance of a cold front, warm front, you name it. We'll go into more details about that. We're also going to go over some details about how to plan for your trip or things or steps you can take to plan for your trip, both related to logistics and to the weather. Also, trouble areas that are common around the United States and even the Caribbean that you should be aware of should you be sailing in those areas. We'll also talk about kind of, as I said, linked to the planning your trip portion, preparing for adverse weather, as well as tips you can, or steps you can take to prepare for local sailing versus offshore sailing. We'll talk about a little bit more about what we do here at Weather Routing to assist clientele with their go and no-go recommendations, as well as available weather resources to a client or to a sailor, as well as seaweather.net, which is a supplemental platform to what I do here with Hugh and Deb. So with respect to clouds, they tend to change ahead of systems. And as I said in the first discussion, Mother Nature does give you some pretty solid clues as to whether, the weather is going to be delightful or if there are some changes for the worse coming up. So it's important from a briefing standpoint to, have a basic understanding of what the clouds are doing to better determine, what upcoming weather you might be up against. It's not all bad. I mean, because, certainly clearing skies indicates that, good weather's coming. But whenever you see, clouds building in, that can usually be a sign that the weather's not exactly improving. So there's that old saying, but it's so true. Red sky in the morning is another way of sailors take warning. And then red sky at night, sailors delight. And that these certainly learning how to read the clues in the cloud cover can inform you of upcoming weather. So cumulus clouds are very common, especially in the summer months. These clouds tend to be more shallow, usually because of a lack of moisture. So cumulus clouds in association with cirrus clouds tend to be the strongest indicators of relatively fair weather. These occur within ridges of high pressure, and as I said, are signs of limited moisture. However, there is a caveat to that because cumulus clouds can develop even further, which can be the sign of an approaching cold front. So while cumulus clouds appear benign and harmless on their own, certainly it's not always the case that they remain cumulus clouds, because while there's not enough moisture initially, certainly more moisture can develop that results in more instability for further development of these clouds, and then they become cumulonimbus clouds. So basically, one of the things that cumulonimbus clouds are best known for is their anvil structure. And what happens is, for a cloud to develop, warm, moist air is rising within cooler, drier air, and the drier air tends to be more dense. So what happens is that warm, moist air is condensing into clouds, and as it's rising, that's an indicator of instability. So it keeps rising and rising and rising until it can't rise anymore. And what happens is it can't rise anymore because it's encountered a stable layer of air. So instead of continuing its vertical ascent, it will ultimately fan out and create this anvil-like structure. Now, with cumulonimbus clouds, the biggest thing to take away from them is that usually squally thunderstorms can develop with them. In the most severe of activity, you can get water spouts too. And they're very common ahead of cold fronts. So whenever you see a cumulonimbus cloud, especially on a widespread scale off in the distance, that's an indicator that there's a cold front coming. Not every cumulonimbus cloud that you see is an indicator that a front is coming, especially if it's a more of a lone wolf isolated scenario. But certainly when you're seeing multiple of them on the horizon, that can be an indicator of further trouble brewing. So cirrus clouds, as I said, are usually associated with fair weather, but they can be associated with signals of an increasingly a notable change in in the upcoming weather, because usually what will happen is these are high level ice clouds. They tend to increase in moisture with time, and as a result, they also increase with density. Up to 24 hours or less before the approach of a storm. They can also indicate a warm front passage as well too. Now, altocumulus clouds tend to occur after cirrus and usually occur closer to the onset of the storm. Cirrus clouds, I said, tend to occur within, up to 24 hours out, but altocumulus clouds tend to be more common within 12 hours. And these can occur behind warm front passages as well. So not only can cirrus clouds occur ahead of warm front passages, but certainly other clouds like altostratus and nimbostratus can be common too. And usually those are the ones you'll get the rain with. So when a system is approaching or ongoing, usually nimbostratus clouds will be the most common ones that you see. So the precipitation occurring will also result in reduced visibilities. That can result from fog, but it can also result from low cloud cover that's not quite at the surface. Certainly fog is basically cloud is a cloud deck right at the surface of the earth. But whenever the visibility increases, that's associated with a decrease in precipitation. And when you have that decrease in precipitation, that means the weather is going to improve. So now moving on to surface analyses and the types of clouds you can see within different areas of a surface analysis, like with high pressure, with cold fronts, etc. We have a large area of high pressure. You can see centered off of off the mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas. And this was actually Tropical Storm Debby that just moved on shore of Florida last week. And this system certainly caused a lot of problems with flooding in the Carolinas. And we actually got quite a bit of rain here in New York from this system too at the tail end of last week. But that aside, you can see that large area of high pressure northeast of there. Fair weather is associated with ridges and large expansive areas of high pressure. So cirrus and cumulus clouds tend to be common with high pressure ridging. But as I said, cirrus clouds can still develop in advance of approaching systems. And in a way, you have Debby in this case lifting northeastward. So there certainly would have been occasional cirrus clouds, likely in the Carolinas and the Delmarva ahead of this system. Now, with troughs of low pressure, as indicated by these dashed lines, usually you get rain and maybe a few thunderstorms. Cumulus and cumulonimbus clouds tend to be more common with those, but usually they don't have the same effect on thunderstorm development that cold fronts do, because of the fact that they're not really temperature boundaries. They're more so wind boundaries. But they create enough lifts, ahead of fronts that they can certainly result in developing showers and even thunderstorms. So cumulonimbus clouds, can be common with these as well. But it's with cold front passages that cumulonimbus clouds tend to be most volatile and most substantial, as you can see for the strongest and most severe cumulonimbus clouds. With the anvils, usually you'll tend to get those ahead of a sharp cold front. If we're talking about a more widespread scenario here, So as I said in the previous discussion, you would want to keep an eye out for a more widespread level of these types of clouds to determine, if this is a scenario you need to duck into port
That
or,
top one, both of those are animals blowing off the top. That's never good.
yeah, no, definitely not. And certainly they're beautiful to look at. Don't get me wrong, but certainly that's not something you would want to get close to, because they can be very dangerous and if not deadly. So definitely they're interesting to admire from a distance, but certainly staying away from them is, for safety's sake is important. But you will generally see these ahead of cold front passages because of the volatile nature of the weather that can develop ahead of those. Now, like I said, what develops in advance of warm fronts, altostratus clouds is another type of cloud that can be one of the more prevalent clouds ahead of these passages, and they just give these overcast and unsettled looks to a given area. Certainly, it definitely doesn't make for a very nice weather day, but certainly it's one of those scenarios where the bark is worse than the bite. So, whenever you see, altostratus clouds or those associated with a warm front passage, it's not necessarily a signal that you would need to pull into port, but it's certainly, worth considering, keeping in mind if you prefer to have the most ideal weather possible. Unfortunately, we can't always make that happen, but if you are looking for, the most ideal weather possible, certainly this would be one to avoid as well, even though it won't have any safety, it won't pose any safety hazards to you. So as far as planning your trip is concerned, as I said, there's the logistical component to it, but there's also the weather component to it. Um, you know, Knowing your vessel through and through is very important. When I work with clientele here at Weather Routing, there's two metrics that we consider. We base our recommendations off of thresholds that are provided to us by the captain. Now, usually what will happen is the boat can handle a certain amount, but the captain prefers to keep the thresholds below a certain amount because they want to keep the trip comfortable, even if the boat can handle higher. So it's important to know what your vessel can handle, and to know what you're comfortable with. So assessing the tolerance of your crew will be very important, because if you're looking to embark on a transit, that may feature some rough weather, it's important to sort out these details at the beginning of a trip. And certainly with respect to the tolerances, knowing local versus longer offshore trips is also important, because of the fact that remaining local is less likely to expose you to heavier weather concerns. You have easier access to bailout options if the weather does turn sour, where you might not have those luxuries if you're taking a longer or more offshore passage. So understanding the tolerance of the vessel and of the crew is very important, especially for those longer passages that you might have. Now, as far as handling, rough weather on longer passages, kind of tying into the last one, certainly that's the biggest thing in my opinion that, aside from the safety of the crew, that would need to be considered for a longer passage, and especially if it's looking like the weather's not going to be that favorable. Certainly, it's not only a matter of, potentially running into squalls and thunderstorms that could be an issue. There are areas around the world which are known as trouble spots that can, on their own, because of their complex topography, can pose issues to localized weather. And we're going to go over some of those areas here in due course. So I've chosen a few in the United States as well as in the Caribbean, as you can see by this list. And these areas are generally known for, weather phenomena that are driven by diurnal temperature gradient differences between land and sea. So for example, across Cape Mendocino and Point Conception in California, those tend to be more reflective of, land and sea surface temperature differences, which I'll go into a bit more detail here in a little bit. But other areas are more affected by funneling, such as Hispaniola, Colombia, and even Cape Hatteras. So Hispaniola has two areas of concern for sailors and for any vessel that's transiting across them, but you tend to get funneling east to southeasterly winds along northern Hispaniola. You also tend to get them around southern Hispaniola, around this cape called Cabo Beata. And it's really around Cabo Beata that the conditions can be quite notoriously bad, and unfortunately can persist for days on end, if not longer. And that's because of the of the shape of the cape, that causes some very strong funneling to occur along these areas. And certainly it's more pronounced when you have a stronger ridge that's extending from the Atlantic towards Hispaniola. So these issues are prevalent along northern Hispaniola too, but not as much as further south. So ideally, if you're making a passage north of Hispaniola, you ideally would want to wait for a cold front passage, if you're looking to make the transit in the winter when the ridge is naturally stronger further south. In the summertime, the ridge is certainly more subject to its ebbs and flows of strengthening and weakening. So certainly, you can get more favorable windows, without the assistance of a cold front, which certainly becomes less and less common as we go into the warm months with that front trajectory shifting further north across the United States. But certainly for a vessel heading west to east, that's something to keep in mind, is that you certainly would be battering into those winds. And it's even more pronounced along the coast, because of the fact that you have more enhanced funneling there, but there's also a phenomenon called shoaling, which can result in the buildup of seas. And when you have those buildup of seas, they tend to be shorter period and choppy, and it can be quite unpleasant. So,
Alex,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Just for you guys, for any of you who might be transiting the Dominican and Puerto Rico and the Mona Passage, check my course schedule, because we do take you through Van Zandt's book that he wrote years ago called A Gentleman's Passage South, which will allow you to take, I've taken today's technology to be able to give you what that particular sail will be like, and why you will be sailing at different times of days, and the problems that we have in these different areas. So that happens to be one very specific area that if you're looking at coming south and doing that this winter, make sure that you pick up that class so that you don't miss the really necessary information that will make that passage a lot easier for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Deb. Another area of concern is actually an area that Deb had been in earlier this year, northwestern Colombia, Santa Marta, Cartagena area. That area is also notorious for the funneling and shoaling concerns that I had just addressed with Hispaniola. And certainly those northeasterly winds are driven by a thermal trough of low pressure that tends to be quite permanent across this region. And when it interacts with a stronger ridge to the north, that intensifies it even further. So ideally, like across Hispaniola, you would want to see a cold front shifting eastward to weaken the ridge, which then in turn weakens the interaction between those two features. But certainly that tends to be more common during the winter months, just because of the fronts being further south across the United States and Florida at that time of year.
Alex,
yes.
Does that have any bearing on the fact that the Sierra Nevada mountain range at the 8,000 feet is coming right at Santa Marta at sea level? We're going from 0 to 8,000 feet above sea level with the Sierra Nevada mountain range.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it could. One of the reasons why I think that's certainly, a realistic scenario is because of the fact when you have that elevation difference, you obviously get the temperature difference between the land and the water, but it's less pronounced there than, say, in California. But when you have that elevation difference, you can really see, a difference in temperature, and the downward momentum on the downsloping that can occur there can also contribute to to some of those winds that you might see along northwestern Colombia. aside from the thermal trough that happens to extend across that region.
Perfect. And our boat is still there. So our boat is still in Santa Marta. And so at some point we'll continue on, but the sailing is quite good in Colombia, and it has been an extraordinary it was an extraordinary sail from the Grenadines to Colombia, and being able to stop at the ABCs and to be in Colombia now.
Yeah, no, definitely there's good opportunities for sailing that way with the winds in place. And, certainly, for those who want to, are interested in those higher winds, yeah, it's definitely, definitely a lot of wind to be able to sail with. But you also get, along in the ABC Islands, you get a lot of easterly wind too. So there's a lot of, jiving involved. But yeah, no, as you said, there's definitely good opportunities to sail, and would rather be going westward and southwestward than the other way around and sailing into it.
Never want to.
But yeah, no, it's definitely, that's another area of concern, at least along the immediate coast. Further off the coast, the shoaling tends to not be as much of an issue, but you can certainly still get larger seas there too. So it's all about timing the windows right. In the wintertime, you do get those narrow windows that open up. Other times of year, it's a bit more challenging, but they do present themselves. Now in the Bahamas, other areas to be concerned about include the Northeast Providence Channel and the tongue of the ocean. Certainly in the winter months, you get the stronger ridging that also affects Hispaniola in Colombia. That can result in strong northeasterly winds propagating into the Northeast Providence Channel, and ultimately into the tongue of the ocean, which can result in a larger sea state there. But sometimes you will still get a scenario where there's a distant system or a tropical system like Ernesto passing east of the Bahamas now, that's propagating that easterly swell towards the Northeast Providence Channel and the tongue of the ocean. So depending on the scenario, if it's a system like Ernesto, distantly off to the east, that swell tends to be a longer period. Wind is not as much of a concern in this case because of the fact that a broad ridge is in place west of the system. But for scenarios where you do have the stronger ridging in place, the seas are likely to be shorter period in nature. So certainly could result in a choppier, bumpier ride across the Bahamas. Bringing it a little closer to the United States, Cape Hatteras can be a notoriously unfavorable location as well because of funneling. This is especially true ahead of cold front passages, where southwesterly winds can really pick up. It's not only about cold front passages, though, and the reason why I include this screenshot of the Gulf Stream is because of the fact in the wake of cold fronts, especially during the winter months, you get these strong ridges that build in behind it. And whenever you get a northeasterly wind over a current that's originating from the southwest, it's just a recipe for a very choppy sea and a very uncomfortable sea. So certainly sailing around Hatteras requires care. There's certainly multiple places you can pull in along the Outer Banks, and especially closer to Morehead City and Beaufort. But certainly you would want to time your window around Hatteras when the winds are not, gusting out of the southwest and becoming locally enhanced due to the funneling, or out of the northeast. And certainly if you were in a situation where you were finding yourself rounding Hatteras when the winds were out of the northeast, you would want to be closer to the coast than the Gulf Stream, just because of the concerns that I had addressed with that building choppy southwesterly sea or northeasterly sea on top of this northeastward moving swell or current. Cape Mendocino is located across northwestern California, north of Fort Bragg and south of Crescent City. And ultimately, you would want to be prepared for, multiple days in which this trough would persist. And so certainly having the flexibility to get around these areas would be important. And in fact, right now, we're seeing fluctuations in this thermal trough across northwestern California that's enhancing the northwesterlies. It's allowing for some very narrow windows to develop, but it's proving for a challenge for any clients trying to get down the West Coast on our end. So the funneling around Cape Mendocino can be problematic, especially if you're a northbound vessel, because you'd be sailing into it, which is not ideal. But even a southbound vessel, you would need to consider jibing if you decided to be out in stronger northwesterly winds. And certainly shoaling is an issue here too. But when you get those buildup of the northwesterly winds, usually the sea state responds in kind too. So it can be quite nasty and unfavorable over a several day stretch. And then also in California, Point Conception is another notoriously rough area because of funneling. And a lot of the same effects are in play here that are in play across Cape Mendocino. Certainly the thermal trough is stronger further north. So any windows around Point Conception tend to be a little less narrow, and any delays around Point Conception tend to be a little less pronounced. But certainly having that flexibility to be able to get around the coast and the Cape is important to have in mind for your plans. So with respect to severe weather, there are multiple hazards that can play out on the open waters. And of course, probably the biggest one is waterspouts. Just because of their erratic nature, certainly they tend to develop with the most severe of squalls. Waterspouts are not the only concern that you have to be prepared for, but gusty winds associated with squalls can be an issue, as well as larger seas that can result from a nearby storm. And these seas can be, certainly be influenced by thunderstorms nearby. They could be influenced by a gale that's off, a ways off. There's multiple scenarios you have to be prepared for when you're out on the open water. So going back to the forecast, it's always good to give yourself a briefing on the weather forecast before you depart. This will help you to better understand, what are the potential pros and cons of a window? Like, is the weather going to be favorable, or is there going to be severe weather that you're likely going to encounter? So that can be done, by using a combination of surface analyses or other weather resources, which I'll talk a little bit more about here. Excuse me, in a little bit. One of the drawbacks is you may have limited access to radar. If you can get access to that, that's vital. That will only help you navigate around risky weather situations. Kind of turning it back to observations, evolving cloud structures and having an understanding of those will help you to better understand, what weather might be threatening your area. In the short term, this could be over the course of the next few hours, or this could be over the next day or two. So, going back to our discussion on clouds, they really can clue you in on, the behavior, their behavior and what they're exactly indicating for weather in the days ahead. Excuse me. Assessing wind directions. So what I mean by this, it's always important to note what direction the wind is coming from, because most storms, they usually come from a direction that has a westerly component to it. Winds that are out of the southwest or the west tend to be some of the most common directions, but they can also originate out of the northwest. And the northwesterly direction tends to be the more pronounced concern, owing simply to the fact that storms that come from the northwest are more associated with cold front passages. So, having access to radar and understanding how clouds are evolving over a shorter or slightly longer period of time, knowing what direction the storms could be coming from if they're developing. So I'd be more concerned, for example, if I saw cumulonimbus clouds originating from the northwest or the west versus if I saw them from the east. Because unless we're talking about an area of low pressure where storms are basically coming from the north or from the east, the vast majority of the time they'd be coming from the west or a component of the west. So know the warning signs of approaching thunderstorms. If it appears that the clouds are getting closer, the cumulonimbus clouds are getting closer, or if you can see dark skies on the horizon and they only appear to be getting darker with time, it's a pretty sure sign that, thunderstorms are approaching your location. And if the thunderstorms happen to be closer, it's always good to monitor lightning strikes and the frequency of those. So think the 5-second rule. If you count 5 seconds between lightning strikes, between a rumble of thunder, that thunderstorm, that lightning strike was about a mile away, and then add 5 seconds for every additional mile between when you hear lightning and thunder. And then water spouts, as I had mentioned, unfortunately can be quite erratic out on the water, and even tornadoes on land. They don't exactly follow a straight path. So in the case of a water spout, it's always a good idea to understand which direction the storm is moving. You ultimately would want to steer away from a water spout, and basically move in an opposite direction to it. Don't try to outrun it, but move at a perpendicular direction to, or a parallel. So if a water spout is moving, say, northward, you would want to turn the vessel southward to get as far away from it as possible. So as I said, there are resources available to sailors who are out on the open water. Some of the most common ones include the National Weather Service in the United States, or NOAA, but there's also various weather apps that you can be downloaded to your cell phone or onto your desktop, including Windy. There's also Predict Wind, which is another popular one for sailors. They lack the human element, though, and that's one of the biggest drawbacks to these. Weather models are basically an output. They don't have any human input into them. So basically, there's more that goes into a forecast than besides, a model data-driven forecast, because kind of going back to our previous discussion across, the trouble spots, the terrain can really affect the weather forecast, and the models don't always do the best job at picking up on these concerns. Like, for example, models are very notorious for underestimating the northeasterly winds across northwestern Colombia, or even the east to southeast winds along northern Hispaniola. So just knowing how the funneling affects those areas, having that human element can really add an extra layer of value to a forecast that a computer generated model may not be able to. And that's where weather routing comes in to assist you with your planning. A little more about that here in a little bit. With respect to local and offshore sailing, certainly flexibility is an important component for any trip you're planning, especially if you're planning a longer passage. Make sure that you do have an ample fuel supply, because as I said in the first discussion, having very nice weather in an area of high pressure can be quite great. But when you're looking to sail and fuel constraints are concerned, it's really not that ideal. So if you find yourself making a longer passage that's going to involve ample periods of motoring, make sure you have an ample fuel supply. And that if the weather does sour on you, or is going to sour on you while you're making this passage, have a plan to bail out for heavy weather. And this can involve stopping somewhere for several days at a time until the weather clears up. But that's where we come in here at Weather Routing. We work with you to make sure that you're finding the most comfortable window and the safest window to make your passage from point A to point B. And you can see in this example, this is what a forecast would look like from Weather Routing. These forecasts, basically what we do is we customize each scenario to your yacht's specific needs. So we base the forecast off of weather thresholds you provide us. So let's say you were not comfortable with being out in seas more than 6 feet or winds more than 25 knots. If you tell us that you were looking to depart on such and such day, and we determine, basis the forecast, that the wind and seas were going to exceed those thresholds, we would not validate that departure, and instead we would recommend an alternative departure option for you. So obviously safety is the first and most important goal and priority when we work with our clientele, but we also do want you to be comfortable. We understand that there are some logistics that can, throw a wrench into your flexibility, but, we want to certainly work with you to make sure that you're on the most flexible, safest, and comfortable trip. So at the end of the day, regardless of whether you use a weather router or you use, apps on your cell phone or your desktop, it's important to consider the reputation of the provider you're using and their dedication to the science of meteorology. Like I said, having that human element does give you years of experience working with meteorologists. who have seen the weather patterns develop over the years and understand exactly, what the weather models might not pick up on. If it's an emergency situation and you need to contact someone to get a forecast, the accessibility is important too. Here at Weather Routing, for example, we are available 24/7, which also ties into the reliability. We make sure that we avail ourselves to our clientele, that they can access us whenever they need us at any time that they need us. And if you're using a news channel meteorologist, for example, certainly scrutinize the on-air talent. What drives weather features in Florida is not going to be the same as what drives weather features in California or Nevada. So it's always important to make sure to scope out that, their knowledge on the local area that they're doing forecasting for, before you consider them a reliable weather source. So we also we'll be offering a complimentary trial of our supplemental resource called seaweather.net. Basically, how this source works, it's basically a supplement to our customized routing and forecasting service. I'll certainly, you will have the option to review multiple weather parameters on our website, and you get access to our tropical tracker, which is certainly very important this time of year, in the midst of the Atlantic hurricane season, which fortunately has not been as active as expected at this time, but we do expect, certainly as we head into September, that it's going to ramp up further. But access to those tropical advisories and daily basin summaries is another very important thing to have and very useful to have. But for attending this webinar tonight, you will be entitled to a complimentary forecast and a sea weather trial. So if you did wish to set up services with us, when you do set up, you could just let us know that you learned of us through Deb Marler's webinar, and we can certainly apply a coupon to your forecast. And with that, I'd be happy to open the floor to any and all questions that are there.
Alex, this is Deb.
Hey.
Hey, folks, anybody have any questions? You guys can come off mute at this point. So if anybody has a question, you can either raise your hand or you can just speak up. Don't be shy.
So we're going to be crossing the Gulf of Mexico, hopefully at the end of November, from Kima, Texas to the Florida Keys. How long in advance do we need to be in touch with you to try to find that best weather window?
I would definitely recommend, anywhere from 3 to 5 days is usually when forecasts, we're most tuned into the details, meaning that, we're able to see any nuances that might have existed in the days prior. We've been able to fine tune those and have a clearer picture as to what kind of window you'd be looking at. Now in November, the Atlantic hurricane season certainly is winding down, but you'd be more subject to cold front passages coming across.
I wonder where they're at.
And that's something you'd have to plan.
Right, they're not on their boat, are they? Stepping out once they run out of place.
So I think let me just fill you in.
Maybe they're
I am not on the boat.
Doesn't look like it.
And our boat is in Columbia. We happen to be in Cincinnati, Ohio this week. And we have just come out of 3 weeks in Grenada, where I've been teaching and doing retreats for both couples and women. So 2 different retreats. And so, Kara, did you get your question answered? You feel comfortable with what you got from Alex there?
I'm looking.
I'm happy to clarify further too.
He's looking down at something.
No, I saw his eyeballs come up. He looked right at the screen.
You guys could, we've got a bunch of people open. So if you'd like to speak, I'm happy to have you speak, but if you can hold it so we can hear each other, that would be great. So, Kara, are you good? Okay. Lori Hughes, do you have a question?
We are good here. Thanks, Deb.
Sure. Anybody else have a question? Well, I'm shocked and pleased because that means that Alex did a great job making sure that you guys got lots of information. Quinn is asking the question, what's the furthest out that you can predict yeah, the Bahamas to the Canaries is average of 22 days.
Thank you.
So Quinn, do you have anything else on that question that you would like to ask Alex?
Basically, if I was to go from the Bahamas to the Canaries and I wanted like a weather report, that average time is going to be about 22 days. How far out can he predict as far as from my departure to reaching the Canaries?
So thank you, Quinn, for the question. So as far as being able to predict into the future, certainly with the trip being about 22 days, usually we can see out to 15 days. Certainly as you get out beyond day 10, the accuracy tends to diminish just simply because of the ever-changing evolution of the forecast. But one thing that we do, in your situation, if you're making a longer passage like that, is because we're reviewing your forecast and your route multiple times per day. We're taking the real-time trends and we're using that to adjust your route. So if we see any changes to your route that are beneficial to you to stay away from heavy weather, as those longer range details come into better focus, we're going to work with you to make sure you're on that comfortable route.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Anyone else? I want to make sure I didn't miss anyone. So anyone who may have missed when we first came on, because we did want to give you a just to get started, we are recording this session tonight, and so both the first and second session will be recorded, and you'll be able to download it, as well as tomorrow or the next day you will receive an email from me with your code for your free class, which is on comfortable cruising. And then of course, Alex's offer for a free forecast in CNET. And I think what we're all very grateful for so far is that it has been a lighter than predicted season for hurricanes. And that certainly is not to diminish what I just came back from the Grenadines and know to be true there, because they were devastated. The amount of damage is incredible. It's so hard to see, believe, and I just hope that we are able to make it through this hurricane season and just have it be a light season so that we just can move on. And so for all of you, I want to thank you for being here. If you do have questions that come up afterwards, you are welcome to send an email to me. You've got my email. If you have questions for Alex, I will get them to Alex and he will respond to you directly. And hopefully we will be able to continue to provide these kinds of educational resources so that you can continue to learn and feel more comfortable on the water, and get out there and have some great sailing, because there's a lot of great sailing to be had.